There was an afternoon in 1978 when Meryl Streep stood alone in her cramped Manhattan apartment, staring at a script she couldn't bring herself to read. Outside, the city hummed with life, horns blaring, voices rising and falling like waves, but inside, everything felt unbearably still. Her hands trembled as she held the pages. Not from excitement. From fear. Because somewhere between the praise and the rising fame, she had begun to feel like she was vanishing. She was 29 years old. On the verge of everything. And she had never felt more lost. The world would come to know Meryl Streep as one of the greatest actresses of her generation, a woman who could disappear into any role, any accent, any life that wasn't her own. But what few would ever understand was how close she came to disappearing altogether. Not from the screen. From herself. This is the story of a woman who nearly lost her voice while learning to speak in 1,000 others. A story of love and loss, of survival and reinvention, of the quiet strength it takes to remain whole when the world wants to consume you piece by piece. Mary Louise Streep grew up in Bernardsville, New Jersey, in a home that smelled of fresh laundry and her mother's quiet discontent. It was the 1950s, and the suburbs were supposed to represent the American dream. Manicured lawns, station wagons, families gathered around dinner tables. But beneath the surface of that dream, there were cracks. Her father, Harry Streep, was a pharmaceutical executive, a practical man who measured success in promotions and paychecks. He was steady, reliable, emotionally distant. He loved his family in the way men of his generation did, quietly, without fuss, without much conversation. Her mother, Mary, had once dreamed of being a singer. She had a beautiful voice, the kind that could fill a room and make people stop mid-conversation to listen. But she had married young, had children, settled into the life expected of her. Her dreams were folded up and tucked away like old love letters no one reads anymore. Meryl watched her mother closely. She saw the way Mary would hum while doing dishes, her voice carrying a longing that had nowhere to go. She saw the way her mother performed cheerfulness at dinner parties, playing the role of the perfect wife, the gracious hostess. And Meryl learned, even as a child, that life was a series of performances. So she became very, very good at performing. In school, she was the girl everyone liked but no one truly knew. Blonde, pretty, smart, but careful. She learned early to soften her intelligence so boys wouldn't feel threatened. She learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to make others feel comfortable, to blend in while quietly excelling. When she was elected homecoming queen in high school, she accepted with a gracious smile. But inside she felt like a fraud. Because she knew the girl they had crowned wasn't really her. It was a version she had constructed, polished, palatable, safe. But beneath that surface, something was stirring. A hunger. A restlessness. A need to be seen for who she really was, not just who people wanted her to be. When Meryl arrived at Vassar College in 1967, America was in turmoil. The Vietnam War raged overseas. Students across the country were protesting, marching, demanding change. Women were burning bras and fighting for equality. The old rules were being questioned, torn down, rebuilt. But Meryl stayed on the sidelines. She studied hard. She acted in campus productions. She kept her head down and her opinions to herself. She was good at that. Being invisible while being seen. Then, during her junior year, she auditioned for a production of August Strindberg's Miss Julie. It was a brutal, unflinching play about class and desire and the destruction that comes when people break the rules. Meryl was cast as Julie, a tortured aristocrat caught between her privilege and her longing, her dignity and her desperation. Rehearsals were intense. The director pushed her to go deeper, to stop performing and start feeling. And one night, during a run-through, something shifted. She stopped thinking. Stopped calculating. She let herself be messy and raw and vulnerable in a way she never had before. When the scene ended, she stood on that stage, breathless and shaking. And she realized something terrifying. She had just shown people who she really was. Not the polished girl. Not the homecoming queen. The complicated, aching, uncertain person underneath. She had disappeared into the role. And in doing so, she had found herself. Or so she thought.
After Vassar, Meryl was accepted into the Yale School of Drama, one of the most prestigious acting programs in the country. She threw herself into the work. She studied voice, movement, text analysis. She played Shakespearean heroines and Chekhovian dreamers. She was talented. Everyone said so. But Yale was also where she began to understand the cost of her gift. Because the more she learned to disappear into characters, the harder it became to remember who she was when the lights went down. She graduated in 1975 and moved to New York City with a suitcase full of dreams and very little money. The city was gritty and dangerous and beautiful. She loved it immediately. She auditioned constantly. She landed small roles off-Broadway. She worked as a waitress to pay rent. She shared a cramped apartment with 2 other struggling actresses. They ate cheap pasta and drank cheaper wine and talked about art and ambition late into the night. It was hard, exhausting, uncertain, but it was also exhilarating. Because for the first time in her life, Meryl wasn't performing for anyone but herself. Then, in the summer of 1976, she met John Cazale. He was performing in a public theater production of Measure for Measure in Central Park. Meryl had been cast as Isabella, the virtuous young woman who must choose between her principles and her brother's life. John played the Duke, a role he inhabited with a quiet, weary dignity. John Cazale was not a movie star. He was 42 years old, 15 years older than Meryl, and he looked even older. His face was lined and sad. His body was thin, almost frail. But he was one of the most respected character actors in the business. He had appeared in The Godfather, The Conversation, Dog Day Afternoon. Every film he had been in was a masterpiece. And when he looked at Meryl, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen. They began spending time together after rehearsals. They would walk through the city, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood in Boston, his years of struggling in New York, his love of theater over film. She told him about New Jersey, about her mother's lost dreams, about the fear that she was becoming someone unrecognizable. John listened. He didn't try to fix her or advise her or tell her who she should be. He just listened. And Meryl, for the first time in her life, stopped performing. With John, she could be uncertain, messy, real. They fell in love slowly, quietly, the way 2 people fall in love when they're not trying to impress each other. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was simple and true. For a year, they were inseparable. They acted together. They shared a tiny apartment in Soho. They cooked meals and read scripts and built a life that felt like home. And then, in the spring of 1977, John collapsed during a rehearsal. The diagnosis came quickly. Lung cancer. Stage 4. Terminal. The doctors gave him months, maybe a year if he was lucky. There was treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, but no cure. John Cazale was going to die. Meryl was 27 years old. She was on the verge of her career. She had just been cast in The Deer Hunter, a massive, ambitious war film that could change everything for her. And the man she loved was dying. She could have left. No one would have blamed her. They weren't married. They had only been together a year. She was young, talented, full of promise. He was sick, fading, slipping away. But Meryl stayed. She moved into his apartment in Tribeca. She learned how to administer medication, how to monitor symptoms, how to hold him when he vomited from the chemo. She canceled auditions. She turned down roles. She called agents and directors and explained over and over that she couldn't commit to anything long-term. Her friends worried. Her family worried. Everyone told her, gently at first and then more insistently, that she was sacrificing too much. That she needed to think about her future. That this wasn't her responsibility. But Meryl didn't see it as a sacrifice. She saw it as love. Still, the weight of it pressed down on her like a stone. She was exhausted, terrified. Watching someone you love die is like watching the sun set in slow motion. You know it's happening, you know you can't stop it, but every moment still feels like a small death. And then the deer hunter came calling again. Director Michael Cimino wanted her desperately. The role of Linda, a small-town woman waiting for the men she loves to come home from Vietnam, was small but crucial. And Cimino believed Meryl was the only actress who could bring the necessary depth and heartbreak. Meryl didn't want to go. How could she leave John? But John wouldn't let her refuse. One afternoon, when he was feeling strong enough to sit up in bed, he took her hand and looked at her with those sad, kind eyes. "You have to go," he said. "You have to keep living, Meryl. Even if I can't." So she went.
Filming The Deer Hunter was hell. They shot in Thailand, in the suffocating heat and humidity. The production was chaotic, over budget, behind schedule. The scenes were grueling, hours of emotional intensity, of waiting and weeping and wondering. But the worst part was being so far away from John. She called him every day from a payphone in the small Thai town where they were staying. The connection was terrible, crackling, distant, full of delays. But she needed to hear his voice. Needed to know he was still there. Some days he sounded strong. Other days he could barely speak. Meryl would hang up the phone and walk back to her hotel room and cry until she had nothing left. Then she would wash her face, go to set, and pour all of that grief into Linda. Years later, critics would praise her performance in The Deer Hunter. They would talk about the quiet devastation in her eyes, the way she communicated entire lifetimes of loss with just a look. What they didn't know was that she wasn't acting. She was surviving. John Cazale died on March 12, 1978. Meryl was with him when it happened, holding his hand in a hospital room in New York. He was 42 years old. They had been together for less than 2 years. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there, staring at his still face, unable to process that he was gone. The funeral was small. John had been a private person, and his family wanted to keep it that way. Meryl stood in the back, numb and hollow, listening to people talk about what a great actor he had been. What a kind man. What a loss. But no one talked about what it felt like to lose him. The specific shape of the absence he left behind. After the funeral, Meryl returned to her apartment in Manhattan. It was a different apartment than the one she had shared with John, but it still felt haunted by him. She unpacked boxes she didn't remember packing. She sat on the floor surrounded by her things and felt like a stranger in her own life. The phone rang constantly. Her agent. Producers. Directors. Everyone wanted Meryl Streep. The Deer Hunter was about to premiere, and word was already spreading about her performance. Offers were pouring in. But Meryl couldn't bring herself to care. She spent days in bed. She stopped answering the phone. She ate when she remembered to and slept when exhaustion finally overtook her. She let herself fall apart. One evening, her brother Harry called. He didn't ask how she was doing or offer empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. He just said, "You're going to be okay, Meryl. But you have to let yourself be sad first." So she did. For weeks she grieved. Properly, fully, without apology. She cried until her eyes were swollen. She screamed into pillows. She wrote letters to John that she never sent. And slowly, quietly, she began to put herself back together. In June of 1978, a friend invited Meryl to a small dinner party in downtown Manhattan. She almost didn't go. She wasn't ready to be around people, to smile and make conversation and pretend she was fine. But something made her say yes. At the dinner, she met Don Gummer. He was a sculptor, tall, gentle, with kind eyes and a calm presence. He didn't talk about movies or fame or the art world's latest drama. He talked about form and texture, about the way light moved through space, about the satisfaction of working with your hands. Meryl found herself relaxing in his presence. She wasn't performing. She wasn't pretending. She was just sitting at a table, eating pasta, talking to a man who didn't need anything from her. A few weeks later, Meryl's apartment lease ended. She hadn't found a new place yet. She had been too depressed, too overwhelmed to look. Don heard about her situation and offered his Soho loft while he was out of town for a few weeks. "Stay as long as you need," he said simply. She moved in with a single suitcase, intending to stay just until Don returned. But when he came back, she was still there. And neither of them wanted her to leave. They didn't rush into anything. Don understood that Meryl was still grieving. He gave her space when she needed it, and company when she didn't. They talked late into the night, about loss, about art, about what it meant to build a life worth living. Don had been married before. It hadn't worked out. He knew about heartbreak, about starting over. And he didn't try to fix Meryl or save her. He just walked beside her while she healed. Slowly, carefully, Meryl began to feel something she thought she'd never feel again. Hope. They were married in September 1978, just 6 months after John's death. It was a small, quiet ceremony at her parents' home in Connecticut. No press. No photographers. Just family and close friends. Some people whispered that it was too soon. That she was rebounding, running away from grief. But Meryl didn't care what people thought. She knew the truth. Don wasn't a replacement for John. He was a different kind of love. A quieter, steadier love. The kind of love that builds a foundation instead of burning bright and fast. And she needed that foundation. Because her career was about to explode.
Kramer vs. Kramer changed everything. The film, released in 1979, told the story of a marriage falling apart and a custody battle over a young son. Meryl played Joanna Kramer, a woman who leaves her husband and child because she's suffocating, drowning, disappearing under the weight of other people's expectations. It was a controversial role. Audiences weren't used to seeing a mother abandon her child, even temporarily. Many people hated Joanna, called her selfish, cruel. But Meryl understood her. Because she knew what it felt like to disappear. Working on the film was challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her co-star, Dustin Hoffman, was known for his intense, method approach to acting. He pushed boundaries. He improvised. He didn't believe in coddling his scene partners. During one scene, he slapped Meryl harder than they had rehearsed. She wasn't expecting it, and the shock and pain on her face were real. Hoffman later said he did it to get an authentic reaction. Meryl didn't complain. She didn't storm off set or demand an apology. She simply noted it, filed it away, and kept working. Because she had learned something important over the past few years, she was stronger than people thought. Stronger than she had thought. She had survived losing John. She had survived grief that felt like drowning. A slap was nothing. Kramer vs. Kramer earned Meryl her first Academy Award. When her name was called, she walked to the stage in a simple black dress, accepted the Oscar with grace and humility, and thanked the people who mattered. She didn't mention the struggles, the grief, the nights she had questioned whether she could keep going. She just smiled and said thank you. The 1980s were a whirlwind. The French Lieutenant's Woman, Sophie's Choice, Silkwood, Out of Africa. Meryl Streep became a household name, a critical darling, an actress who could do anything. But she never forgot what it felt like to almost disappear. So she built a life that anchored her. She and Don had 4 children, Henry, Mamie, Grace, and Louisa. They bought a home in Connecticut, far from the chaos of Hollywood. Meryl planted a garden. She cooked meals. She attended school plays and soccer games. She chose roles carefully, not for the acclaim, but for the challenge. She played women who were complicated and flawed and deeply human. Women who made mistakes. Women who survived. And she protected her family fiercely. Her children grew up away from cameras and red carpets. She rarely gave interviews about her personal life. She built a wall between Meryl Streep the actress and Mary Louise the mother and wife. Because she had learned the hard way that fame could consume you if you let it. That the world would take everything you had to give and then ask for more. So she gave them her work. And she kept the rest for herself. There's a story Meryl once told in an interview, years later. She was asked what she was most proud of in her career. The journalist expected her to talk about the Oscars, the iconic roles, the decades of acclaim. Instead, Meryl said, "I'm most proud that I'm still married to the same man after all these years. That my children are kind and thoughtful. That I still love what I do." The journalist looked disappointed, as if those things didn't count as achievements. But Meryl knew better. Because the greatest performance of her life wasn't on a screen. It was the quiet, daily work of remaining whole. Of choosing love over ambition when it mattered. Of building a life that was hers, not the world's. Today, Meryl Streep is in her 70s. She has more Oscar nominations than any actor in history, 21 and counting. She has played queens and prime ministers, fashion editors and nuns, singers and suffragettes. But if you ask her what role has been the most challenging, she'll tell you the truth. Herself. Not the polished version. Not the icon. Just the woman underneath, messy and complicated and beautifully, perfectly human. The woman who almost disappeared, but chose to stay.